Yorkshire in the mid-1970s was a region of stone-built towns and industrial cities spread across the northern hills of England, a place where mill chimneys still dominated skylines and working-class communities maintained traditions that had endured for generations. Bradford, Leeds, Halifax, Huddersfield, these were cities built on wool and textiles, cities where people worked hard, lived modestly, and took pride in their capacity to endure. But between 1975 and 1980, Yorkshire became known for something else entirely. It became the hunting ground of a killer who attacked women with hammers and knives, leaving bodies in fields and waste ground, creating a climate of fear so pervasive that women across northern England altered how they lived their lives. The press called him the Yorkshire Ripper, invoking Jack the Ripper and the Victorian terror that name carried. And for 5 years he operated with apparent impunity, while one of the largest police investigations in British history failed repeatedly to identify him. The killer's name was Peter Sutcliffe. He was a truck driver from Bradford, a small, bearded man who lived in a modest terraced house with his wife Sonia, who worked night shifts driving heavy goods vehicles across northern England. He was unremarkable in every visible way, quiet, polite, someone neighbors would describe as ordinary, someone who blended into the working-class landscape of West Yorkshire so completely that even when police interviewed him 9 times during their investigation, they let him go every time. Between October 1975 and November 1980, Peter Sutcliffe murdered 13 women. He attacked at least 7 others who survived, though some were left with permanent physical and psychological damage. His victims were women walking alone at night, women who worked as prostitutes, women who had the misfortune to be in the wrong place when Sutcliffe was hunting. He struck them from behind with a hammer, often killing them with the first blow, sometimes stabbing them repeatedly after they were down. The investigation consumed thousands of police hours, generated tens of thousands of tips, interviewed hundreds of suspects, and was derailed catastrophically by a hoax that led police to focus on entirely the wrong region and the wrong suspect profile for years. When Sutcliffe was finally caught, it was not because of brilliant detective work, but because 2 patrol officers in Sheffield stopped a car with false number plates and noticed something suspicious about the nervous man in the driver's seat. This is the story of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. This is the story of 13 women who died and 7 who survived. This is the story of a police investigation that failed despite enormous resources, and of a city and region that lived in terror for 5 years. These are the fatal headlines. Part 1. The Making of a Killer. Peter Sutcliffe was born on June 2, 1946, in Bingley, West Yorkshire, a small mill town between Bradford and the Yorkshire Dales. He was the first of 6 children born to John Sutcliffe, a mill worker, and Kathleen Sutcliffe, a housewife. The family lived in modest circumstances in a working-class neighborhood where most men worked in the textile mills or in heavy industry. Peter's childhood was marked by his father's domineering personality and his mother's quiet subservience. John Sutcliffe was a physically imposing man who ruled his household with harsh discipline and casual cruelty. He was unfaithful to Kathleen, conducting affairs that were known to the family and to neighbors, humiliating his wife in ways that Peter witnessed throughout his childhood. Peter was small for his age, slight and timid, a target for bullies at school. He was not academically strong, leaving school at 15 with minimal qualifications and going to work in a series of unskilled jobs: grave digger, factory worker, eventually truck driver. He showed little ambition beyond earning enough to get by. But Peter had an interior life that was darker and more complex than his exterior suggested. He was obsessed with prostitutes from an early age, spending time in the red light districts of Bradford and Leeds, sometimes hearing women, sometimes just watching them. He later claimed that a prostitute had cheated him out of money in his early 20s, an incident that he said had filled him with rage toward sex workers, though the veracity of this claim is questionable. In 1967, Peter met Sonia Sharma, a Czech immigrant's daughter who was intelligent and ambitious, training to be a teacher. Sonia came from a more middle-class background than Peter, and her family viewed Peter as beneath her. But Sonia was attracted to Peter's quiet intensity, and they began a relationship that would last the rest of Peter's free life. The relationship was troubled from the beginning. Sonia had high expectations and a sharp tongue. Peter was passive and resentful. They argued frequently, and Peter later claimed that Sonia's criticism and his inability to satisfy her expectations fueled his rage toward women. This explanation is self-serving and should be treated skeptically, but it became part of Peter's narrative about his crimes. In 1974, Peter and Sonia married. They bought a modest terraced house in Bradford and settled into what appeared from the outside to be a conventional working-class marriage. Peter worked night shifts as a truck driver. Sonia taught. They had no children. Neighbors described them as quiet, private, unremarkable. But in July 1975, Peter attacked his first victim. Anna Rogalskij, a woman walking alone in Keighley, was struck from behind with a hammer and slashed with a knife. She survived, though with serious injuries. The attack was reported to police but not initially connected to any pattern. In August 1975, Peter attacked Olive Smelt in Halifax, again using a hammer and knife. She survived. The attacks were brutal and apparently motiveless. The women were not robbed, not sexually assaulted in the conventional sense, simply attacked with extraordinary violence and left for dead. On October 30, 1975, Peter killed for the first time. Wilma McCann, a 28-year-old mother of 4, was walking home in Leeds after a night out. Peter struck her with a hammer and stabbed her 15 times. He left her body in a field where it was found the next morning. The pattern was set. Peter would drive through the red light districts and working-class neighborhoods of West Yorkshire, looking for women alone. He would strike them from behind with a ball-peen hammer, crushing their skulls. If they survived the initial blow, he would stab them repeatedly. Then he would leave their bodies where they fell or drag them to nearby waste ground. Peter later claimed that he heard the voice of God commanding him to kill prostitutes, to cleanse the streets of their presence. This claim formed the basis of his insanity defense at trial, but psychiatrists who examined him found little evidence of genuine psychosis. The divine mission appeared to be a construction, a way of explaining his violence that positioned him as an instrument of higher purpose, rather than as a sadistic killer acting on his own impulses. What seems more likely is that Peter killed because he enjoyed the power it gave him, because it satisfied rage and sexual compulsion that he could not express any other way, and because he believed, correctly for years, that he could get away with it. Part 2. The First Murders. Wilma McCann's murder in October 1975 was the beginning of a series that would terrorize Yorkshire for 5 years. Wilma was 28 years old, a mother of 4 children, surviving through part-time work and prostitution. She had spent the evening of October 29 drinking in Leeds city centre. Around 1 a.m. on October 30, she was seen getting into a white car. Her body was found the next morning in a field off Scott Hall Road in the Chapeltown area of Leeds. Wilma had been struck twice on the head with a hammer and stabbed 15 times in the chest and abdomen. The violence was extreme and excessive, suggesting that the killer's motivation was not robbery or sexual assault in the conventional sense, but the violence itself. The wounds indicated a frenzied attack, someone who continued stabbing long after the victim was dead. The Leeds police investigated Wilma's murder but made little progress. The location was a rough area, the victim was a prostitute, and while police took the case seriously, the investigation lacked the intensity that would have been applied to the murder of someone from a more respectable background. On January 20, 1976, Peter killed again. Emily Jackson, 42 years old, was killed in Leeds, her body found in an alley near Garrard's timber yard. She had been struck on the head with a hammer and stabbed 51 times with a Phillips head screwdriver. The weapon marks indicated the killer had stamped on the screwdriver, driving it through her body with his full weight. The violence of Emily Jackson's murder was extraordinary and disturbing to investigators. This was not someone killing quickly to eliminate a witness or to cover a robbery. This was someone who derived satisfaction from inflicting maximum damage, who continued the attack long past the point of death, who seemed to revel in the destruction of the human body. The police now recognized they had a serial killer. Two women, both associated with prostitution, both killed with similar methods. Hammer blows to the head followed by stabbing. The Yorkshire Post began referring to the killer as the Yorkshire Ripper, consciously invoking Jack the Ripper and the Victorian London murders that remained Britain's most famous unsolved serial killer case. Peter then went quiet for more than a year. Whether he was processing what he had done, whether circumstances prevented him from hunting, or whether he was simply exercising restraint is unknown. But in February 1977, the killings resumed. Irene Richardson, 28 years old, was killed on February 5, 1977 in Leeds. Her body was found on Soldiers Field, a popular walking area. She had been struck 3 times with a hammer and slashed across the throat and abdomen. The attack had the same characteristics as the previous murders: extreme violence, hammer blows, stabbing, the victim left in an exposed location. On April 23, 1977, Patricia Tina Atkinson, 32 years old, was killed in her flat in Bradford. This murder was different from the previous ones. Tina was killed indoors rather than on the street, and she was not a street prostitute, though she did occasionally exchange sex for money. Her body was found in her bedroom, struck with a hammer and stabbed multiple times with a sharp instrument. The fact that Peter had followed Tina into her flat and killed her there represented an escalation in boldness. He was willing to spend time at a crime scene, to take the risk of being heard or seen. This suggested growing confidence, decreasing fear of capture. On June 26, 1977, Peter attacked Jane MacDonald, 16 years old, in Leeds. Jane was not a prostitute. She was a shop assistant walking home from a night out with friends. Peter struck her from behind with a hammer and stabbed her repeatedly. Her body was found in a playground the next morning. Jane MacDonald's murder changed the public perception of the case. The previous victims had been adult women, most of them prostitutes, and while their deaths were tragic, they had not generated the level of public outrage that Jane's death did. Jane was young. She was innocent, in the way the media framed it, and her murder made clear that the Ripper was not just targeting prostitutes, but could kill any woman he encountered. The investigation intensified dramatically after Jane's murder. Public pressure increased. The media coverage became constant and sensationalistic, and West Yorkshire police, already struggling with the investigation, faced mounting criticism for their failure to catch the killer. Part 3. The investigation and its failures. The police investigation into the Yorkshire Ripper was one of the largest and most expensive in British criminal history, eventually involving hundreds of officers and consuming millions of pounds. It was also one of the most catastrophically mismanaged, characterized by missed opportunities, tunnel vision, and a failure to use available technology and analytical methods. The investigation was led initially by Detective Chief Superintendent Dennis Hoban of the Leeds Police, later by George Oldfield of the West Yorkshire Police. Oldfield became the public face of the investigation, conducting press conferences, appealing for information, visibly carrying the weight of the case as the body count rose. The investigation faced genuine challenges. This was before DNA analysis, before computerized databases, before the kind of forensic and analytical tools that modern investigators take for granted. The case generated enormous amounts of information, tens of thousands of tips, hundreds of suspects, thousands of witness statements, and processing this information manually was overwhelming. But the investigation also made serious unforced errors that would be exposed after Sutcliffe's capture. The first major error was failing to connect the attacks on survivors with the murders. Several women had survived attacks by the Ripper: Anna Rogalskij, Olive Smelt, Maureen Long, Marilyn Moore, and some had provided descriptions of their attacker or details about the vehicles he was driving. But the investigation treated these attacks as separate incidents rather than as part of the pattern, missing opportunities to develop composite descriptions and to focus on specific vehicle types. The second error was allowing class bias and misogyny to influence investigative priorities. When victims were prostitutes, the investigation was less intense and received fewer resources than when victims were respectable women. The media distinguished between innocent victims and prostitutes, and this distinction influenced public and police attitudes. Some officers openly expressed the view that prostitutes brought their fate upon themselves, a view that was both morally repugnant and investigatively counterproductive. The third and most catastrophic error was the hoax tape. In June 1979, the investigation received a cassette tape from someone claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper. The voice on the tape, with a distinctive Wearside accent from the Sunderland area, taunted police, provided details about the murders, and seemed to know information that only the killer would know. Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield became convinced the tape was genuine. He played it at press conferences, distributed copies to media, and focused the investigation on finding a man with a Wearside accent. Resources were diverted to the northeast of England. Suspects without Wearside accents, including Peter Sutcliffe, who had a Yorkshire accent, were deprioritized or eliminated from consideration. The tape was a hoax. It was sent by a man named John Humble, who had no connection to the murders and was motivated by unclear reasons, possibly mental illness, possibly a cruel joke, possibly a desire for attention. Humble was not identified until 2005, long after Sutcliffe's capture, and he was convicted of perverting the course of justice. The hoax tape was the single most damaging element of the investigation. It misdirected police for more than a year, wasted enormous resources, and allowed Sutcliffe to continue killing, while police focused on entirely the wrong area and the wrong suspect profile. Peter Sutcliffe was interviewed by police 9 times during the investigation. 9 separate times, officers questioned him in connection with various aspects of the case. He had been seen in red light areas. He drove vehicles that matched witness descriptions. He fit the general profile in some respects. And 9 times, the officers let him go, failing to see in the quiet, polite truck driver from Bradford the man they were looking for. This failure was partly due to the hoax tape. Sutcliffe didn't have a Wearside accent, so he didn't fit what police believed was the killer's profile. But it was also due to inadequate interview techniques, failure to check alibis thoroughly, and the simple reality that Sutcliffe was skilled at presenting a calm, normal front to authority. The investigation also failed to utilize geographic profiling or other analytical techniques that might have identified the killer's base of operations. Sutcliffe lived in Bradford, worked as a truck driver based in Bradford, and most of his attacks occurred within a relatively small area of West Yorkshire and Lancashire that included Bradford. A competent geographic analysis might have pointed to Bradford as the likely home base, narrowing the suspect pool considerably. But such analysis was not performed systematically. By 1980, the investigation had cost millions of pounds, had consumed the careers of numerous officers, and had failed to prevent multiple murders. The public's faith in the police was eroding. Women across Yorkshire were living in fear, changing their behavior, avoiding going out at night, and Peter Sutcliffe continued to drive his truck routes, returning home to his wife Sonia, maintaining his facade of respectability. Part 4. The later victims. The killing continued with terrible regularity through the late 1970s and into 1980. On January 21, 1978, Yvonne Pearson, 21 years old, was killed in Bradford. Her body was found weeks later under an overturned sofa on waste ground, where Peter had hidden it. She had been struck with a hammer and stabbed. Peter later admitted that he had returned to the site where he'd hidden Yvonne's body and jumped on the sofa to better conceal it, an act that demonstrated his disturbing calm and his willingness to revisit crime scenes. On January 31, 1978, Helen Ritka, 18 years old, was killed in Huddersfield. Helen and her twin sister Rita worked as prostitutes, usually working together for safety. On the night Helen was killed, they had separated briefly, and Peter encountered Helen alone. She was struck with a hammer and stabbed. Her body was found in a lumber yard. On May 16, 1978, Vera Millward, 40 years old, was killed in Manchester. This was Peter's first murder outside of West Yorkshire, representing a geographic expansion that complicated the investigation. Vera was a mother of 7, working as a prostitute to support her children. She was struck with a hammer and stabbed in the car park of Manchester Royal Infirmary. On September 1, 1979, Barbara Leach, 20 years old, was killed in Bradford. Barbara was a university student at Bradford University, walking home from a party. She was not a prostitute, and her murder generated enormous publicity and public pressure. Students at Bradford University organized safety patrols and demanded increased police protection. On April 4, 1979, Peter attacked Josephine Whittaker, 19 years old, in Halifax. Josephine was a building society clerk walking across Savile Park when Peter attacked her. She was struck with a hammer and stabbed multiple times. Her murder, like Jane MacDonald's and Barbara Leach's, reinforced that the Ripper would kill any woman he encountered, not just prostitutes. On September 2, 1979, Peter attacked Barbara Leach, a Bradford University student, killing her near her student accommodation. On August 20, 1980, Marguerite Walls, 47 years old, was killed in Leeds. Marguerite was a civil servant walking home from work. She was strangled rather than struck with a hammer, a deviation from Peter's usual method that initially led police to question whether she was a Ripper victim. On November 17, 1980, Jacqueline Hill, 20 years old, was killed in Leeds. Jacqueline was a student at Leeds University, attacked while walking home. She was struck with a hammer and stabbed. Her murder generated massive publicity and public outcry. Students and women across Yorkshire organized protests and safety patrols. The pressure on police to catch the Ripper was overwhelming. Jacqueline Hill was the last person Peter Sutcliffe murdered, but he would not be caught because of the investigation finally succeeding in identifying him. He would be caught by chance, by 2 patrol officers in Sheffield noticing something odd about a car with false plates. Part 5. The capture. On the evening of January 2, 1981, 2 South Yorkshire police officers, Sergeant Robert Ring and Constable Robert Hydes, were on patrol in the Broomhall area of Sheffield, a neighborhood known for prostitution. At approximately 9 p.m., they noticed a car parked in a dark lane near the Melbourne Avenue area. The car, a Rover with a woman inside, had false number plates. The officers approached and questioned the driver, who gave his name as Peter Williams. The woman with him was Olivia Reevers, a sex worker who explained she was with the man commercially. The officers ran checks and confirmed the plates were false. They arrested Peter Williams for having false number plates and took him to the local police station. The man was actually Peter Sutcliffe, though the officers didn't know it yet. Before getting into the police car, Sutcliffe asked if he could relieve himself. The officers allowed this, and Sutcliffe walked behind an oil storage tank where he quickly discarded a ball-peen hammer and a knife that he'd been carrying. At the police station, Sutcliffe was processed for the false plates offense. He gave his real name, Peter William Sutcliffe, and his address in Bradford. A routine computer check revealed that Sutcliffe had been interviewed multiple times in connection with the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, and that his car had been flagged as matching witness descriptions. A detective was called in. The investigating officers began asking Sutcliffe about his movements and about the Yorkshire Ripper case. Sutcliffe remained calm initially, providing alibis for various dates, but the questioning continued, and Sutcliffe's demeanor began to shift. Meanwhile, another officer returned to the site where Sutcliffe had been arrested and searched the area. Behind the oil storage tank, he found a ball-peen hammer and a knife with sharpened blade, the tools of the Yorkshire Ripper. The weapons were collected and sent for forensic analysis. On January 4, 1981, after 2 days of questioning, Peter Sutcliffe confessed. He admitted to being the Yorkshire Ripper, to killing 13 women, to attacking several others. He provided details about the murders that had never been made public, confirming that he was indeed the killer that West Yorkshire police had been hunting for 5 years. Sutcliffe's confession was detailed and disturbing. He described his attacks methodically, explaining his methods, his selection of victims, his feelings during and after the killings. He claimed that he was on a divine mission from God to kill prostitutes, that he had heard the voice of God commanding him at a graveyard in Bingley when he was working as a gravedigger years earlier. The confession was met with relief by police and by the public. After 5 years, the Yorkshire Ripper had been caught. Women across northern England could resume their lives without the constant fear. The massive investigation could finally close. But the capture also raised devastating questions. Sutcliffe had been interviewed 9 times. 9 times, police had him in their grasp and let him go. How many women had died in the intervals between those interviews? How many victims might have been saved if the investigation had been more competent? Part 6. The Trial. Peter Sutcliffe's trial began on April 29, 1981, at the Old Bailey in London. He was charged with 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. The prosecution was led by Sir Michael Havers QC, who would later become Attorney General. The defense was led by James Chadwin QC. Sutcliffe pleaded not guilty to murder but guilty to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility. His defense rested on the claim that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, that he heard the voice of God commanding him to kill prostitutes, and that this mental illness substantially impaired his responsibility for his actions. The prosecution called psychiatric experts who had examined Sutcliffe and found no evidence of genuine psychosis. Dr. Hugo Milne, a consultant psychiatrist, testified that while Sutcliffe showed some personality disorders, he was not schizophrenic, was not delusional in the clinical sense, and was capable of understanding that his actions were wrong. The divine mission was a construction, Milne argued, a way for Sutcliffe to explain and justify his actions to himself and others rather than a genuine delusion. The defense called their own psychiatric experts who had diagnosed Sutcliffe with paranoid schizophrenia. They argued that the consistency of his claims about hearing God's voice, the apparent sincerity with which he described his divine mission, and the nature of his crimes all pointed to genuine mental illness rather than calculated evil. The trial judge, Justice Boreham, ultimately decided to reject the plea agreement that would have allowed Sutcliffe to plead guilty to manslaughter. The judge ruled that the jury should hear the evidence and decide whether Sutcliffe was genuinely suffering from diminished responsibility or was simply a murderer trying to avoid full culpability. The trial exposed details of the murders that had been kept from the public. The savage violence of the attacks, the excessive stabbing, the use of a screwdriver in some killings, the fact that Sutcliffe had sometimes masturbated over or near victims' bodies. These details painted a picture of sexual sadism and extreme pathology that contradicted Sutcliffe's claims of a divine mission. The jury heard testimony from survivors including Maureen Long, Marilyn Moore, and others who had been attacked by Sutcliffe and survived. Their testimony was powerful and disturbing, describing the sudden violence of the attacks, the terror of being struck from behind, the pain of the injuries. Sutcliffe himself testified, maintaining his claim that he was on a divine mission. He described hearing God's voice at the graveyard in Bingley, explaining that God had told him to kill prostitutes to cleanse the streets. He claimed that he took no pleasure in the killings, that he was simply following divine commands. Under cross-examination, Sutcliffe's story began to fracture. The prosecutor pointed out that several of his victims were not prostitutes, that his targeting of women like Jane MacDonald, Josephine Whittaker, and Jacqueline Hill contradicted his claims about a mission against prostitution. Sutcliffe struggled to explain these inconsistencies, eventually claiming that he had made mistakes, that God's mission had sometimes led him to attack the wrong people. The prosecution also presented evidence that Sutcliffe had carried his murder kit, hammer and knife, with him regularly while driving his truck routes, suggesting premeditation and planning inconsistent with someone acting on sudden divine commands. On May 22, 1981, after deliberating for approximately 6 hours, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all 13 counts of murder and all 7 counts of attempted murder. They rejected the diminished responsibility defense, finding Sutcliffe fully responsible for his crimes. Justice Boreham sentenced Sutcliffe to 20 concurrent life sentences for the murders and additional concurrent sentences for the attempted murders. The judge recommended that Sutcliffe should serve at least 30 years before being considered for parole, though in practice it was understood that Sutcliffe would likely never be released. Sutcliffe showed no visible emotion when the verdict was read. He was led from the dock and transported to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight to begin serving his sentence. Part 7. Prison Diagnosis and Death. Peter Sutcliffe spent the first 3 years of his sentence at Parkhurst Prison, housed among the general prison population. But in 1984, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia by prison psychiatrists. The same diagnosis his defense team had argued for at trial, and was transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility. The transfer was controversial. Critics argued that Sutcliffe had manipulated psychiatrists into diagnosing him with mental illness to get transferred to a hospital where conditions would be better than in prison. Supporters of the transfer argued that, regardless of his motivations, Sutcliffe genuinely was mentally ill and required psychiatric treatment. At Broadmoor, Sutcliffe was treated with antipsychotic medication and received ongoing psychiatric care. He settled into the institutional routine, occupying himself with reading, art, and interactions with other patients. Broadmoor housed many of Britain's most dangerous mentally ill criminals, and Sutcliffe was among its most notorious residents. In 1997, Sutcliffe was attacked by another Broadmoor patient who stabbed him in both eyes with a pen, leaving him partially blind. The attack was motivated by the nature of Sutcliffe's crimes. Even among the criminally insane, the Yorkshire Ripper was despised. Sutcliffe's wife, Sonia, divorced him in 1994, ending a marriage that had endured through his arrest and trial, but could not survive the reality of his permanent institutionalization. Sonia resumed using her maiden name and withdrew entirely from public life, refusing all media requests and maintaining complete silence about Peter and her life with him. In 2016, Sutcliffe was deemed to have made sufficient progress in his treatment that he was transferred from Broadmoor back to the prison system, specifically to HMP Franklin in County Durham. The transfer meant that psychiatrists believed he was no longer acutely mentally ill, or that his mental illness was sufficiently controlled by medication that he could be managed in a prison rather than hospital setting. Sutcliffe continued to maintain aspects of his divine mission narrative even as he aged, though his later statements were less consistent and more obviously calculated to generate attention. He gave occasional interviews to journalists, always maintaining that he had been on a mission from God, that his crimes had been service rather than murder. On November 13, 2020, Peter Sutcliffe died at University Hospital of North Durham. He was 74 years old. The cause of death was reported as COVID-19, though he had also been suffering from various age-related health problems. He had served nearly 40 years in prison and psychiatric institutions. His death generated mixed reactions. Some felt satisfaction that he had finally died, that he would no longer consume public resources or generate headlines. Some felt that he had been allowed to live too comfortably for too long, that he should have been executed rather than institutionalized. Some simply felt relief that a dark chapter had finally closed. The families of his victims were notified of his death. Some expressed relief. Some said they felt nothing. Sutcliffe had been a shadow over their lives for 40 years, and his death changed nothing about the loss they had suffered. Some said they wished he had lived longer and suffered more. Peter Sutcliffe was cremated. His ashes were not scattered in Yorkshire. The region he had terrorized wanted no memorial to him, no final connection to the man who had brought such horror to their communities. Part 8. The VICTIMS RMBRD. The 13 women Peter Sutcliffe murdered, and the 7 he attacked, but who survived deserve to be remembered not as his victims, but as people whose lives had value independent of the man who ended or damaged them. The murder victims. Wilma McCann, 28 years old, was a mother of 4 children who worked part-time and engaged in prostitution to make ends meet. She was Peter's first murder victim, killed in October 1975. Her children were left motherless, growing up with the knowledge that their mother had been murdered by a man who was allowed to continue killing for years afterward. Emily Jackson, 42 years old, was married with 3 children. She worked as a prostitute to supplement the family's income. She was killed in January 1976, her body found in an alley in Leeds, stabbed 51 times with a screwdriver in an attack of extraordinary brutality. Irene Richardson, 28 years old, was killed in February 1977. She had been living in a hostel in Leeds, working as a prostitute, struggling with the same economic pressures that drove many women into sex work in 1970s Northern England. Patricia Tina Atkinson, 32 years old, was killed in her own flat in Bradford in April 1977. Tina's murder demonstrated Sutcliffe's increasing boldness, his willingness to follow women into their homes rather than attacking only on the street. Jane MacDonald, 16 years old, was killed in June 1977. Jane was a shop assistant, not a prostitute, walking home from a night out with friends. Her murder changed the public perception of the case, making clear that any woman could be a target. Jean Jordan, 20 years old, was killed in Manchester in October 1977. Jean was a prostitute from a Scottish background working in Manchester. Peter returned to her body days after killing her, attempting to remove evidence he had left behind, a £5 note that could be traced. Yvonne Pearson, 21 years old, was killed in January 1978 in Bradford. Her body was hidden under a sofa on waste ground, and Peter later returned to jump on the sofa to better conceal it, a detail that reveals his disturbing calm. Helen Ritka, 18 years old, was killed in Huddersfield in January 1978. Helen worked as a prostitute with her twin sister Rita, usually working together for safety. On the night she died, they had separated briefly, and Peter found her alone. Vera Millward, 40 years old, was killed in Manchester in May 1978. Vera was a mother of 7, working as a prostitute to support her children. She was killed in a hospital car park, attacked with a hammer and stabbed. Josephine Whittaker, 19 years old, was killed in Halifax in April 1979. Josephine was a building society clerk, walking home across a park when Peter attacked her. She was a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Barbara Leach, 20 years old, was killed in Bradford in September 1979. Barbara was a university student at Bradford University, intelligent and ambitious, murdered near her student accommodation. Marguerite Walls, 47 years old, was killed in Leeds in August 1980. Marguerite was a civil servant, a respectable middle-aged woman who had done nothing to draw Peter's attention except be in the wrong place. Jacqueline Hill, 20 years old, was killed in Leeds in November 1980. Jacqueline was a Leeds University student, studying English literature, walking home from an evening seminar when Peter attacked her. She was Peter's last murder victim. The survivors. At least 7 women survived attacks by Peter Sutcliffe, though some were left with permanent injuries. Their courage in testifying at trial and in rebuilding their lives after devastating trauma deserves recognition. Anna Rogalskij survived an attack in 1975 with serious head injuries. Olive Smelt survived an attack in 1975 with permanent damage. Marcella Claxton was attacked in 1976 while pregnant and survived with her baby. Maureen Long survived a 1977 attack that left her with serious injuries, but also left her able to provide a description of her attacker that should have aided the investigation. Marilyn Moore, attacked in 1977, survived and provided valuable information about Peter's vehicle and appearance. Anne Rooney survived an attack in 1979. Teresa Sykes survived an attack in 1980. These women lived with the knowledge that they had come within moments of death, that their survival was partly luck and partly their own strength. They carried physical scars and psychological trauma, but refused to be defined solely as victims. Part 9. The BYFORD Report. In 1982, following Peter Sutcliffe's conviction, the British government commissioned an inquiry into the Yorkshire Ripper investigation to determine what had gone wrong and how such a massive investigation had failed to identify the killer despite interviewing him 9 times. The inquiry was led by Sir Lawrence Byford, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary. The resulting document, known as the Byford Report, was a devastating critique of the investigation and remained partially classified for decades due to its sensitivity. The report identified multiple catastrophic failures. Failure to cross-reference information. The investigation generated enormous amounts of data, but the data was stored in card files and manual systems that made cross-referencing nearly impossible. When Sutcliffe was interviewed multiple times, the different interview reports were not effectively linked, so no one realized the same person kept appearing in the investigation. Failure to utilize available technology. Computer database systems existed in the early 1980s that could have been used to manage the investigation's data, but West Yorkshire Police failed to implement them effectively. By the time such systems were partially deployed, the investigation was already years old, and the data was too overwhelming to input retrospectively. The hoax tape disaster. The report was scathing about the decision to treat the Wearside Jack tape as genuine and to let it dominate investigative priorities for more than a year. The decision to eliminate suspects who didn't have Wearside accents allowed Sutcliffe to be released after multiple interviews. Bias and misogyny. The report noted that the investigation had displayed bias in how it treated different victims, prioritizing respectable women over prostitutes, and that this bias had influenced resource allocation and investigative urgency. Geographic profiling failure. The report noted that basic geographic analysis would have pointed to Bradford as the likely home base of the killer, but such analysis was not performed systematically. Interview technique failures. Sutcliffe had been interviewed 9 times without any of the officers recognizing him as the killer. The report criticized the interview techniques, the failure to check alibis thoroughly, and the tendency to accept Sutcliffe's explanations at face value. The Bradford report's recommendations led to significant changes in how British police handle serial killer investigations. The most important was the development of the Home Office Large Major Inquiry System, HOLMES, a computerized database designed specifically for managing complex investigations with large amounts of data and multiple suspects. The report also recommended better training for officers in interview techniques, better coordination between different police forces, and systematic use of geographic profiling and behavioral analysis in serial killer cases. But for the families of Sutcliffe's victims, the report was cold comfort. The failures it documented had allowed Sutcliffe to kill for 5 years. The women who died after his early interviews might have been saved if those interviews had been more competent, if the systems had been better, if the investigation had been run differently. Part 10. The Cultural Impact and Media. The Yorkshire Ripper case had an enormous impact on British culture, media, and social life that persisted long after Sutcliffe's capture. The media coverage during the active investigation was intense, constant, and often problematic. Newspapers ran daily updates on the case, published details about victims that focused on their sexual histories, and made distinctions between innocent victims and prostitutes that influenced public perception and police priorities. The phrase prostitute appeared in headlines constantly, often in ways that implied the victims bore some responsibility for their fate. When respectable women were killed, Jane MacDonald, Josephine Whittaker, Barbara Leach, Jacqueline Hill, the coverage emphasized their innocence, their promising futures, the tragedy of their deaths in ways that implicitly suggested the deaths of sex workers were less tragic. This media treatment reflected and reinforced misogyny that was pervasive in 1970s and early 1980s British society. Women who worked as prostitutes were seen as having made choices that put them at risk, and their deaths were treated as almost inevitable rather than as murders requiring the same investigative commitment as any other homicide. The feminist movement in Britain used the Yorkshire Ripper case to highlight the dangers women faced and the inadequacy of police protection. Groups like Women Against Violence Against Women organized protests, created safety patrols, and demanded better police response to violence against women. The Reclaim the Night marches that became common in British cities during this period were partly inspired by the Yorkshire Ripper case. Women marched through city centers at night, asserting their right to public space and their refusal to be driven indoors by fear of male violence. The case also influenced popular culture. Books, films, and television dramas about the Yorkshire Ripper appeared regularly over the decades. Some were well-researched and respectful. Others were exploitative, focusing on Sutcliffe and treating the victims as props in a thriller rather than as people whose lives mattered. In 2020, a Netflix documentary series titled The Ripper examined the case and the investigation, generating renewed interest and discussion. The series was criticized by some victims' families for giving Sutcliffe renewed attention and for not focusing enough on the victims. The long-term impact on Yorkshire, and particularly on women who lived through the terror, is difficult to quantify but real. Women who were teenagers or young adults during the Ripper years described the fear as pervasive and formative, something that shaped how they thought about safety and male violence for the rest of their lives. Part 11. Psychological Analysis. Peter Sutcliffe's psychology has been analyzed extensively by forensic psychiatrists, criminal psychologists, and researchers interested in understanding what drives serial killers who target women. The diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia that Sutcliffe received after his conviction remains controversial. Some psychiatrists believe it was genuine, that Sutcliffe did experience auditory hallucinations and delusions that drove his violence. Others believe he fabricated or exaggerated symptoms to gain transfer to a hospital rather than remaining in prison, and that his actual pathology was better understood as sexual sadism and severe personality disorder rather than psychosis. What seems clear is that Sutcliffe's violence was primarily sexually motivated, whatever religious or mission-oriented framework he later constructed around it. The excessive stabbing, the focus on women's bodies, the masturbatory component of some attacks, the escalation in violence over time. These patterns are characteristic of sexual sadism rather than of someone acting on religious delusions. The claim of a divine mission may have served multiple purposes for Sutcliffe. It provided a narrative that explained his violence in terms that made him a servant of higher purpose rather than a simple murderer. It created a potential insanity defense, and it may have helped him psychologically manage the guilt or cognitive dissonance that even serial killers sometimes experience. Sutcliffe's childhood and family environment were troubled, but not exceptionally so, by the standards of working-class Northern England in the 1950s and 1960s. His father's infidelity and harsh discipline were damaging, but were not unique. Many children grew up in similar circumstances without becoming serial killers. What distinguished Sutcliffe was probably a combination of factors: an underlying capacity for violence and lack of empathy that was constitutional or developed very early, exposure to prostitution, and the development of sexual obsessions focused on sex workers. The humiliation he felt from his wife's criticism and his own sense of inadequacy, and a decision at some point that violence against women was justified and satisfying. The targeting of prostitutes is a common pattern among serial killers who murder women. Prostitutes are vulnerable. Their disappearances are often not immediately reported. They work alone in isolated locations, and societal stigma around sex work makes their deaths less likely to generate intense public pressure for investigation. Sutcliffe understood these dynamics and exploited them consciously. But Sutcliffe also killed women who were not prostitutes, suggesting that his primary motivation was violence against women generally rather than specific animus toward sex workers. The divine mission against prostitutes was a rationalization that allowed him to feel justified, but the underlying drive was the violence itself. Part 12. Final Aria Felicitiones. Peter Sutcliffe died in 2020, having spent 40 years in custody for murders that terrorized northern England and traumatized a generation of women who lived through the fear of the Yorkshire Ripper. His death closed a chapter but did not heal the wounds. 13 women are dead: Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Tina Atkinson, Jane MacDonald, Jean Jordan, Yvonne Pearson, Helen Ritka, Vera Millward, Josephine Whittaker, Barbara Leach, Marguerite Walls, Jacqueline Hill. They ranged in age from 16 to 47. Some were mothers. Some were students. Some worked as prostitutes. All deserved to live. 7 women survived attacks that left permanent scars. They rebuilt their lives with courage that deserves recognition and respect. The investigation that finally caught Sutcliffe was one of the largest in British history, but it was also one of the most flawed. The failures documented in the Byford report cost lives. Women died while Sutcliffe was being interviewed and released, while police focused on the wrong geographic area because of a hoax, while bias and misogyny influenced investigative priorities. The lesson from the Yorkshire Ripper case is multifaceted. It is about the importance of competent investigation and proper use of technology and data management. It is about the dangers of bias in how victims are perceived and how cases are prioritized. It is about the need for coordination between different police forces and the value of behavioral analysis and geographic profiling. But most fundamentally, it is about the imperative to value all women's lives equally, to investigate violence against prostitutes with the same intensity as violence against anyone else, and to reject the narratives that suggest some victims matter less than others. The families of Sutcliffe's victims carried their grief for decades. Some found ways to honor their loved ones and to advocate for other victims. Some struggled with substance abuse and mental health challenges. Some simply tried to survive day by day, carrying losses that could never be fully processed. The city of Yorkshire has not forgotten. Memorials to the victims exist. The case is taught in schools and discussed in community centers. The period of the Ripper is part of Yorkshire's collective